There are 4 parts to the test. Part 1. You will hear a chef who cooks food for television programs talking about his work. For questions 1 to 9, complete the sentences.
Hello, my name's Graham Gotham, and I've worked on some very well-known historical dramas on television as what's called a prop chef. I'm responsible for preparing the food that appears on set during filming. I began my career as a cook in the Air Force, but in 1994 I left to work as a freelance chef, not in restaurants, strangely enough, but giving cookery demonstrations in department stores around the country. It was part of a publicity drive to sell gas cookers. I got into television purely by chance. A TV drama was being filmed in the village where I live, and in one scene they needed the food for a picnic, but they couldn't get anybody locally to provide the food. So I thought I'd have a go. The film was set in 18th century England, but the local library had no books on the subject. So I ended up spending hours in the local museum finding out not only what people ate then, but also how meals were served outdoors. The funny thing is that although I never really liked history lessons at school, the research is the aspect of the work I enjoy most. My latest project is trickier, though, as it's set in the 12th century, and unlike the 19th or early 20th centuries, historical records about what was eaten then are rather few and far between. So I had to think around it and consider how people lived. For instance, few of them would have had an oven, so most meat would be cooked over an open fire. As well as being historically correct, the food must also be able to withstand hot studio lights, so it has to be freshly made, and things which melt have to be avoided. If food is there merely for visual effect, it can stay until it starts to smell, though actors get fed up with looking at the same food for 3 days. But if it's actually going to be eaten, health and safety rules must be considered. I certainly wouldn't be popular with the director if I poisoned the leading lady. And when the actors have to eat the food, other problems arise, because many actors are vegetarian. If the characters are eating meat, and people did a lot in the past, I have to make up dishes that look like meat but are actually made of something else. But much more of a problem is judging quantities. You never know how many retakes will be needed. I have to prepare enough food so that plates can be replenished over and over again. It's easy enough peeling lots of potatoes or making salads, but if a scene involves, for instance, a big wedding cake, and it's cut before the director is satisfied, I have to go and seal it up to make it look untouched. But, despite all these problems, I really love my job.
That is the end of Part 1. Part 2. You will hear part of a radio program about a well-known toy called a yo-yo. For questions 10 to 17, complete the notes.
The yo-yo is a toy that everyone must have played with at some time. It's a fairly solid round disc with a piece of string wound round a groove in its middle. At the flick of a wrist, the disc climbs up and down the string as if by magic, and it gives hours of harmless fun. Although yo-yos have been the new craze about once every 10 years since the 1930s, they date back a lot longer than that. Evidence from paintings in art galleries shows that they had certainly reached France by the 17th century. But even before that, the ancient Greeks had them, as is witnessed by a 2,500-year-old vase that depicts a youngster playing with one. But nobody knows for sure where they came from originally. One theory is that they were first used not as toys, but as weapons by people living in parts of Southeast Asia. It is thought that the idea for this weapon first came to hunters, who would hide in trees and throw rocks at animals below. By tying their rocks to a length of string, they got a second chance if their first shot missed its target, without having to climb down out of the tree. The name certainly appears to have come from that part of the world. The first person to make them as toys and give them their modern name was one Pedro Flores, who emigrated to the USA from the Philippines in the early 20th century. His yo-yo was the first made to a new design, where the string is attached to little rollers rather than directly to the disc. This allows the players to perform a certain number of tricks, as well as just moving the disc up and down. It's the sophistication of such tricks that separate the serious player from the rest of us. A businessman named Duncan bought the idea from Flores in 1929, and after that, only his company made them because he maintained that only he had the right to use the name. A court in 1965, however, decided that the word had become so much a part of the language that it could no longer be restricted to one company. Since the 1960s, new types of yo-yo have hit the market. The latest is described as having a brain, because it contains a special mechanism which makes it easier to handle and avoids the need to rewind it if you lose control. Despite its brainy label, however, the yo-yo remains a simple device. Although modern examples use plastic rather than wood as raw material for the disc, the string has always been made from pure cotton, because although this has to be replaced occasionally, it gives the best performance. And like many simple ideas, the yo-yo is likely to go on fascinating generations of kids for years to come.
That is the end of Part 2. Part 3. You will hear a radio interview with 2 people involved in the running of a circus. For questions 18 to 24, choose the best answer, A, B, C or D.
Today in the studio, as part of our series of interviews with famous duos, we have 2 people who've worked together for more than 15 years. Tony Morland is the boss, and Anita Meadows is his personal assistant. Nothing unusual in that, you might think. But what makes this duo a little different is the fact that the business which they both help run is in fact a travelling circus. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hi.
Now, Tony, first, you own the circus. So do you come from one of those traditional circus families? Was it in the blood?
Oh, hardly. I had an unremarkable childhood up to the age of 15. But I'd seen my first circus at the age of about 8. And from that moment on, I'd set my heart on being part of that world one day. I didn't exactly run away to join the circus, but it was very much against my parents' wishes when I went, because they really thought I should be getting some qualifications. No, I don't think they saw much of a future in it.
But what qualified you then for the circus ring? Did you have an act?
No, it wasn't like that, really. The curious thing is that I'd never longed to be a performer. I didn't fancy leaping about on the back of a horse or juggling. No, right from the start, the thing that was uppermost in my mind was the idea of stepping out into that ring wearing the big hat and welcoming people to my circus. So, at first, as far as I was concerned, it was just a matter of getting practical experience of how the circus worked. I was happy doing any job that was going, actually.
And before long you did set up on your own, didn't you? How did you manage that?
Well, I suppose I was about 22, and my dad, who'd come round to the idea in the meantime, helped me by lending me some capital, which I added to my own savings to invest in my first tent. And from then on, I was the boss. I only had a few acts, but later I teamed up with a friend, and the circus has been a partnership ever since. I'd been in business for about 5 years when I realised I really needed more administrative support. And that's where Anita came in.
And what made you join the circus, Anita?
Well, unlike Tony, I never harboured any dreams of going off with the circus. In fact, the idea had never crossed my mind. But when Tony's tent arrived in Manchester, where I was living, I'd just been going through various family difficulties, and I was ready for a change of scene. The idea of just travelling around as the booking office clerk, which is the post that I saw advertised, appealed to me. I thought it would offer a means of escape for a while.
Yeah, she stepped into the role of personal assistant about 5 years later. Well, she was a qualified secretary, so it was a natural progression.
I can't ever remember being asked to become your PA, actually. It just sort of happened.
That's right.
But having been with the circus for a while, I'd picked up a lot about what was involved in the running of the show, and I gradually just took more on, you know. I just did what needed doing, and I've since been on both word processing and accountancy courses to help me cope with it all.
And now I don't know what I'd do without her. I love the circus, but the paperwork would drive me crazy, and it's getting worse.
Oh, you can say that again. And it also includes a fair amount of diplomacy, which, let's say, isn't really Tony's style. I have to deal a lot with local officials when I'm booking the sites where the circus will appear. There's a lot of red tape, and whilst most councils are all right, some do not understand the workings of the circus. For example, I'm presented with unnecessary requests for all manner of health and safety documentation, which is really only meant to apply to big corporations. It has no relevance to us, but there's no point in antagonising them either. You've just got to keep explaining your position calmly and clearly.
Yeah, and she also arranges things like work permits for foreign artists. Oh, that can be a real hassle. Yeah. I have a lot of laughs sometimes, though. My handwriting always comes in for a lot of stick, and Anita's the only one who can decipher it. And she's very willing to work long into the night, if necessary. So, as long as everything gets done, I don't mind if she takes the odd afternoon off to do her own things. I mean, there's no clock watching or standing on ceremony here.
I guess that's where we really see eye to eye in that laid-back approach. Without that, it wouldn't work, and I'd have moved on years ago.
Yeah.
Anita, Tony, thanks very much for joining me this morning.
you.
Oh, thanks.
That is the end of Part 3. Part 4. Now look at the fourth and last part of the test. Part 4 consists of 2 tasks. You will hear 5 short extracts in which various people are talking about vehicles they own. Look at Task 1. For questions 25 to 29, match the extracts as you hear them with the speaker's occupation, listed A to H. Now look at Task 2. For questions 30 to 34, match the extracts as you hear them with the comment each person makes about their vehicle, listed A to H. You will hear the recording twice. Speaker 1.
It was during a public transport strike. I was stuck in a cab, running late for an appointment with a patient, a leading politician. As we passed a showroom window, I saw this moped, and so I jumped out of the cab, rushed in, and 15 minutes later, the sale was complete. I'd had one as a teenager, so I knew how to operate it. I made the appointment on time, and I haven't looked back since. It's not made for speed, but you can still glide past cars in jams, so it doesn't seem slow. It's increased my productivity, critical in these days of financial stringency in the health service, as I couldn't fit in as many consultations without it.
Speaker 2.
My father drove for a living and was also a keen amateur racer, and so for me, the cars came before the drum kit, actually. But thanks to my success with the band, I've been able to indulge my passion. I started with a 1927 Austin, which I only paid £20 for. I was 17 and learnt the rudiments of mechanics on that. My father's view was that part of the fun of running old cars was getting them working. I've got more than 30 at the moment, including the Austin, and some of them were his. Speed in itself has never been the big thing. It's more about getting the maximum from the car and beating the competition.
Speaker 3. I cycle to the office every day. I started after I got fed up with being squashed like a sardine in the tram. My bike's a cross between a mountain bike and a racer, which I put together myself from various old bikes. Cycling's very invigorating. It's healthy and really sets me up for dealing with difficult situations. You get plenty of those working with the homeless. Although I view cycling as doing my bit towards conserving resources, it's hardly a political statement. I love going out in the car at weekends. Just because you do this kind of work doesn't mean you can't enjoy pleasures like that. Fortunately, my husband's got his own business, so we can afford it. Speaker 4.
Modern cars are technically better, they go faster, but they don't have character. They're part of the faceless homogeneity of life today. I wish I'd lived in the first half of the 20th century, when my present car was built by hand. Life then had more style and individualism, and not only for the ruling classes. I used to have a wonderful collection of about 50 individually designed vintage cars, which I opened to the public at weekends, but when the recession hit my firm, I had to sell them all, just to keep afloat. So I've lost fortunes as well as made them, but that's what being an entrepreneur is about, so I have no regrets.
Speaker 5.
I've got quite a large bike, actually, but I'm not a passionate enthusiast. I got into it when I was a starving law student and a car was beyond my means. 20 years later, I still ride one every day when visiting clients. It's a very cost-effective way of getting about. The more weight and power you have, the easier it is to get free of the traffic. But I don't go in for speed much. I believe in wearing all the gear, though, which puzzles people. Sometimes I'll turn up for lunch with a company chairman that I'm going to represent in court and get directed to the mail room because they take me for a dispatch rider.
That is the end of part 4. That is the end of the test.